Well, a big decision on rates is due next month. It will certainly feed into the next election. And how much will inflation, that big number out tomorrow, feed into that? We're live to our political editor, Andrew Clennell. Andrew, just how will this all play out, in particular, of course, the politics of this?
Well, they're waiting with bated breath, people in the government. They think it's a 50-50 proposition. I've got to tell you, Tom, whether there is a rate cut next month. I think it's February 18 that the Reserve Bank meets, and we'll know more when we see that inflation figure tomorrow, which is expected to show inflation within the target band and underlying inflation slightly above the target band of inflation of 2 to 3% annually. So it's become a political football even ahead of this inflation figure tomorrow. Where I spoke to the Prime Minister about it. He denied in this interview at the weekend that he needed the rate cut to win the election. Gee, it'd help though, and it might even determine election timing were they to receive it. Let's have a listen to what the Prime Minister had to say first of all. Peter Dutton also had some comments today. Does your re-election prospects hang on that? Them cutting the first part of this year?
No. We will continue to do what we can, because putting downward pressure on inflation is a good thing in itself. This has been like landing a 747 on a helicopter pad to land that lowering of inflation.
Well, I mean, listening to Stephen Hamilton on with Kieran Gilbert a short time ago, The Economist is thinking maybe an April cut. February might be a bit too early, but April comes after the budget. They'll see the budget settings in the RBA. The government wouldn't want to be hanging on that long. There's every chance that will be the scenario, though. Peter Dutton, well, he's saying they spent too much. Anthony Albanese said in that interview, we've done everything we can to get inflation down. It's now 2-point-something% annually. When we came to office, it was 6% annually. That's his argument. Of course, a lot of Australians have copped about 10 to 15% rises on just about every good and service since then, so they won't see it that way. Peter Dutton basically saying rate cut or no rate cut, the government's made the problem worse.
The Reserve Bank will be looking at every sector of the economy. They'll be looking at what's happening with mortgage holders. They'll be looking at what's happening with small business, as I say, with unemployment, etc. And they'll take all of that into consideration. But if they've got a government with its foot on the accelerator and the Reserve Bank's tapping the brakes, that just always ends in tragedy. And there are a lot of families at the moment who voted for Anthony Albanese believing that good times were ahead, and it's been the complete opposite. And that's why I think people increasingly are souring on the Prime Minister and this bad government.
And Tom, I wanted to point out a real shift in rhetoric from Peter Dutton on China and the Chinese government in this press conference in Perth a short time ago, about half an hour ago. He's always been muscling up in terms of a military or security reaction to the regime of Xi Jinping. But this time, to an audience who very much believes in China powering the WA economy, he's actually saying, or arguing, Peter Dutton, that economically a coalition government can assist with China. And this is the coalition, of course, were in power when the sanctions came on from China after some of the utterances of Scott Morrison, the former Prime Minister. So this is a real change in direction. And of course, there are Chinese voters, Chinese Australian voters who didn't like the Morrison way of doing things with China in the seat of Tangney in Western Australia, and also in the marginal seat of Bennelong in Sydney and other marginals. So a real shift in position. Let's have a listen to Peter Dutton on this.
The relationship with China will be much stronger than it is under the Albanese government. In government, we were able to sign the free trade agreement with China, and they are obviously our most important trading partner. We want there to be mutual respect in the relationship, which is incredibly important.
Interesting attempt at sort of having it both ways, because there's been criticism of, the Labor government hasn't stood up enough to China, and now it's a case of, well, you'll be more respected under the coalition. We'll see how that plays out. Meanwhile, it's been noted to Andrew Clennell, we know Anthony Albanese, a big fan of tennis. He has games at the Lodge. There was the little yarn over there in Perth about him playing tennis during the afternoon, but hasn't been spotted at the Australian Open.
First time in years, I reckon, as Prime Minister, Opposition Leader, or even Transport Minister or Opposition Transport, that Anthony Albanese has not attended the Australian Open, and particularly the Australian Open final. And I put this to him. Because what had been put to me is that he was advised, don't go to the cricket, which all Prime Ministers do, to the pink test in Sydney. Scott Morrison used to, Malcolm Turnbull used to, even though he hates sport. But no appearance there. They obviously don't want a scenario, the Labor hardheads, of the Prime Minister being booed at the cricket or tennis, or that he hasn't got his mind totally focused on the cost of living. So he confirmed this year a non-appearance. He reckons he's in good stead in terms of this election, but I think this shows they're worried. The Sydney Test, you didn't go to that. You're not going to the Australian Open final, something you've done over many years. Is that because you want to show Australians how focused you are on where they're at? And is that an indication of how focused you are on the election?
I'm completely focused on the needs of the Australian people.
And Tom, I'm looking forward to the Politics Now desk with you when Parliament resumes next week, where no doubt we'll talk once again about election timing. I did feel out of this interview the odds are very much about straight after the WA election, he calls it, and there's no budget, and we have an election in April. I'm not discounting May, and I don't think a final decision's been made, but he was keen to point out here, the Prime Minister, when I put it to him, that he's not squibbing it if he doesn't go to a budget this year. And again, I think the Reserve Bank decisions will play into this, but it may well be the decision is taken to go in April and just have some PFO sort of update on March 25 instead of a full budget. Here's the PM on election timing. Are you planning for a potential April election as opposed to May?
No, the budget's scheduled for March 25.
So we will have a budget?
The budget's scheduled for March 25.
That's when it's scheduled. It doesn't mean you have to deliver it. Are we going to have a budget?
Well, it's scheduled. We're working through. The ERC met this week. We're working through the proposals that will form a part of that budget.
Yeah, at the very least, that is wriggle room, isn't it, Andrew, in terms of that timing? And is it realistic that essentially a lot will be governed? You know, if there's suddenly a rate cut, well, all the momentum builds for that. If there isn't, then given the chances of one happening later, then you wait. Is that the logic?
That's how I'm kind of seeing it, but it's all down to the numbers. I mean, I also put to the Prime Minister, Tom, and I'd heard this, that he wanted to go in January, late last year, but the party hardheads got around and said the polling's not exactly where you might want it, Prime Minister, and he was deterred from that. He said that was nonsense, but I'm not so sure. I think both leaders are pretty confident they're going to win. And I wonder where that puts us in the end. I think it puts us in hung parliament territory with no one really in charge, Tom. That's my tip.
Seems deeply there right now, but the next few months will certainly matter. Andrew Clennell, yeah, we'll see next week. Here in Canberra for Politics Now will be a big year, of course,